so much. Thanks, everyone. So you've seen these charts, right? Every year, happiness rankings in newspapers. You don't know where they're coming from. You don't know what questions were on the actual questionnaires and why the Nordic countries always end up on top. You go to the Nordic countries and they're not like dancing around in the streets acting really happy. So it's really unclear, and the conversation tends not to go beyond the word happy. So I want to unpack this a little bit because I think there's a variable in there that we ignore, and I think it's possibly the most important one, and it is the one that separates those countries at the top from the other countries. So what is happiness? What is well-being? It is, and I'm telling you that in these measures of psychological and subjective well-being, and by the way, there are many of them, you tend to have about 4 components. And this is the one that gets talked about the most. So that is presence of good mood. It's happiness. It's high positive affect. The next one is low negative emotion, right? So it's lack of stress. So people are happier if they have fewer stressors. The next one that's gotten a lot of attention in the last 15 years is sense of purpose, something like this: meaningful relationships, meaningful work. How do we spend our time? Do we feel good about it? Are we doing something that feels right? Here's the one that gets neglected. It's personal power, agency, voice. Do people feel that they can bring their skills forward and people will hear them, that they can impact their future, their society, that they have the freedom to be themselves? That is the one that separates those countries at the top from the ones at the bottom. And we ignore this, in part because the word power is loaded. And if you do a free word association, which I used to do with my Harvard students, the most frequent word that would come up after power was corruption. So got a little problem there. So I'm not talking about formal or hierarchical power, not power over others, but the power to. And it is essential. We know this, right? We intuitively know this, but somehow in these happiness scales, when they come out, we don't talk about it at all. So it differentiates those happiest countries from the less happy societies. So the thread through all of my work for 15 years has been personal power. And it came from the fact that my primary area of research as a doctoral student and many years into my professorship was stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. And I still study those things. I still care about those things. And I also knew they weren't going to change quickly. And I wanted to give people tools. I wanted to help people who had less access, who were marginalized, who were excluded. I wanted to help them find something that would make it a little bit easier. And that's how I started to lean into the study of personal power. So what is it? How do we access it? And how does it change us? So personal power, like I said, it's this sort of internal resource where we can access our best skills, our knowledge, the parts of ourselves that we like the best. We can share our preferences without fear. And what happens, and this has been shown in hundreds of psychology studies, is that when people feel powerful, when they have that sense of agency, it activates what we call the behavioral approach system. This is a motivational system that interacts very closely with our nervous system, and it is literally telling us, you may approach. So when we feel powerful, that's the framework we're looking through. When we feel powerless, it does exactly the opposite. It activates the behavioral inhibition system. And that is an alarm threat system that tells you you are not safe and you better back away. But look at, when we broaden the research on this, well, what's happening when the behavioral approach system is activated? So in these psychology studies, what's happening? What's happening is this. When the approach system is activated, everything on the left, people see challenges not as threats, but as opportunities to grow, to connect, to win. It doesn't matter, but they see it as an opportunity. When the inhibition system is activated, they see it as a threat. And you can go down this whole list. They're more trusting of other people. They see other strangers as potential allies, not as predators or competitors. And that is fundamental to building relationships. If you go into every new situation and you see the other people as, as the enemy, it's not going to work well. It's not going to. They become more creative because they are free to think. They are not cognitively rigid. They have an abundance mindset when they are in that approach state versus a scarcity mindset. They feel secure, not defensive. They're braver, not just on behalf of themselves, but on behalf of others. They're more likely to simply take action because they're not second-guessing themselves. If they observe something, they respond to it. I'm not saying that they're impulsive, but they trust what they just saw and their interpretation of it. The work that I'm doing now, the book that comes out next year, is on adult bullying and bravery and bystander behavior. Why do we not stand up for each other? And the best predictor of adults standing up for each other is sense of personal power. I didn't even expect to find that. But people will stand up for others when they have that sense of personal power. And again, that's action, approach action. So moving into space and the physical world, what do our bodies do when we feel powerful? Let's look at a whole bunch of sports and a whole bunch of people. And this is true across cultures. It's been studied in 36 cultures on 5 continents. And the researcher who studied this, Jessica Tracy, found that when she showed people pictures of people from other cultures in that posture and said, what is that person feeling? They said words like power, pride, and confidence. What that tells us is that this is hardwired. Just like smiling and happiness are hardwired universal expressions of an emotional state, expanding is a universal expression of an emotional state, and it's the state of feeling powerful. Even congenitally blind athletes do the same thing. Even if they haven't learned this, this is obviously a professional athlete, but it's true for athletes who have never seen anyone do that. Guess what? Animals do it too. We are animals. And we've known that since 1872, when Darwin said, every species that he looked at, he saw that when they were showing power, they expanded. It's not just primates, right? It's other animals standing on the hind legs, their ears up. You see snakes do this, birds, the peacock, raising and fanning and its tail feathers and strutting around. That is a show of power. And what happens when we feel powerless? Exactly the opposite. We make ourselves small. And this is both to hide from predators and to not offend those in charge. Because if you step out of line and you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, and when I say primates, I'm talking about us too, you get punished, right? So I think it's so important for us to remember how self-reinforcing this body language is. So this is indicating this is not just hiding, it's also indicating to the individual in charge, don't worry, I'm not going to try to hurt you. And you see it in other animals, same kinds of thing, the tail between the legs, look at the ears flattened, the hair down close to the ground. Humans do the same thing, doesn't matter how big and strong they are. When they are losing, they start to collapse, they shrink, they wrap themselves up, they touch their faces and heads because they're covering themselves to protect themselves. They get small, they get low to the ground. Whether you're on the team or you're just watching the team, this is what happens when we feel powerless. But what we know is that by expanding or contracting our bodies, we can also reverse engineer our feelings of personal power and powerlessness. So it's not simply that it is an expression of a feeling. It's also a cause of that feeling. So I'm not going to be able to go through all of these studies, I'm just going to quickly tell you, sort of from the top of the head to the bottom, how this works. Breathing. When we breathe quickly and shallowly, it's because the inhibition system is activated. It's telling us to get out of there. When we feel powerful, it slows our breathing. We breathe more deeply. You can reverse this. Simple breathing techniques, and you can look them up. My favorite is just 4-7-8 breathing, where you inhale for 4 counts, hold it for 7, exhale for 8. Do that 3 times. It is so calming. So if your arousal level's up here and you need it to be here, do that. If it's here and you're about to go for a long drive, don't do it. It will make you sleepy. And I do get to sleep doing that. Here's another one, voice. You think of voice as speech, words. It's not nonverbal, but it is also nonverbal. Think of all the we call them paralinguistic cues that are associated with speech, like how much range do you show? Do you pause? Do you speak in a high or low voice? Do you speak quickly or slowly? And the one that's linked to power is the one that is about expansiveness. It's how quickly or slowly do you speak? So when you speak quickly, you're nervous. You're feeling powerless. You're trying to get through it really fast. You're taking up less temporal space. When you feel more powerful, you slow down. With your friends, you're not rushing. Think about being cold called in class. I know lots of you have advanced degrees and have been cold called. It is not a pleasant experience. And I would hear my students rush through their comments at Harvard Business School because they were trying to not take up space. They felt powerless. But so it is associated with being perceived as powerful or powerless. So people who speak slowly, perceived as more powerful, but it also causes those emotions. So when you slow people down, they feel more powerful. When you have them speak quickly, the same sentences scrolling across a screen quickly, they feel less powerful, less confident, less in charge, less in control. Simple posture. The posture of the person on the right is the posture of somebody with clinical depression. The posture of the person on the left is the posture of no one, I think because of phones, but in theory, it's the posture of someone who's not depressed and was clearly trained well by their parents to sit up straight. But clinical psychologists started to think, how do we treat depression? We need some other techniques, right? Like obviously we know this is difficult. So they started to think about body language, which they notice. Anyone who goes into a therapist, your therapist is also watching your body language and taking notes on that. So they just simply had people who were depressed randomly assigned to either sit up straight for 2 minutes or to slouch for 2 minutes. And the people who sat up straight for 2 minutes scored lower on 29 of 30 items on the Beck Depression Inventory, which is one of the most commonly used depression scales. Now, that's the immediate effect. I'm not saying that's long-term, but imagine that we start putting these things together over time. Complex postures like this, which are things that we don't do necessarily in front of people or shouldn't really do in front of people, versus these, which are things that we do when we feel powerless, cause us to feel more or less powerful. They cause us to be more creative, to be more trusting, to have more positive memories from our past, to perform better in job interviews. The list goes on and on. So simply changing our posture, again, in private, helps. Walking, look at this. You've got the walker on the right is more powerful than the walker on the left, or feeling more powerful. So this data comes from a researcher named Nico Troya, who has people on a treadmill with motion capture sensors walking, and then he has them fill out these emotion scales. And he finds that when people feel more powerful, they take longer strides, there's more up and down vertical movement, the shoulders are down, they are taking up more space. And when he reverses it, he finds the same thing. When you have the person walk like the one on the right, and by the way, that's aggregated across thousands of people. When you have the person follow the walker on the right, they feel better after doing that than the person on the left. So this works in both directions. Our physicality is causing us to feel things, and those feelings are changing the lens that we look through. There's so much research recently on dance, and small personal story, left Boston about 2.5 years ago. We moved to Venice Beach. It was not completely unrelated to the fact that I'm a roller dancer as a hobby. And I was, working all the time. And I would be working on a chapter, not finishing it, and just sitting there all day, tied to my desk, determined to finish this chapter. And I realized, because we went out for a couple months several years ago, that if I went out and roller skated for just an hour, I came home and I finished that chapter. I felt better. I trusted myself. So we've got all of these pieces. More powerful, more confident, more relaxed, more trusting, more creative, more agentic. But let's move on to how this applies to the spaces that we occupy. And let me just say, just take a nice look at that slide, because this is the evidence that I do not know anything about design. My slides are horrible. And so I'm not claiming to be a designer, but I am going to tell you what I know about the research that has been done. And I'm going to strongly encourage you to do more research in this area, because if we're talking about well-being, if we want societies to thrive, we can't just do things that make people happier, more comfortable. Those things are all important. They need to feel empowered. We need to give them a reason to feel more powerful. That's how progress happens, right? That gets passed down to the next generation. We know that people intuitively, perceptually link power to vertical position. So stages, overlooks, mezzanines, things like that, and to ascension. So if they see somebody going up the steps, they perceive that person as more powerful than somebody going down the steps, which makes no sense. But that's how tightly linked those concepts are. We also know that high ceilings prime freedom and broader, more divergent and relational thinking. So in other words, when people are working in a place that has a high ceiling, they feel freer, they feel more open, their approach system is activated, they can be more creative, and they can see relationships between concepts. So when I say relational, I don't mean in a social way. When they're in low ceilings, they tend to think in a more convergent, when we call it item-focused thinking. So it's more rigid. It's focused on individual concepts and not how they link to each other. We also know that more open and visually permeable rooms activate the approach system. They do exactly what feeling powerful does, and that effect is even stronger if you have curved contours in the room. We don't know exactly why this is, but is likely because curved edges are already challenge the way we think a bit. They lead us to feel more open, more flexible in how we see things. So we've got some information. I'm sure know that crowded, tight layouts, forced proximity reliably reduces perceived control and sense of personal power while increasing stress. So people need either buffer zones, because I know that there's not always an option to not have this set up, but they need to know they can escape. They need a choice of distance. And the same is true for open plan offices. Even if they're not crunched together, if they remove control of interactions, they change the way we think, and people begin to feel less powerful. This one there's not a lot of work on this, but this happened in the last week and a half. Two of my friends happen to be in Egypt. They don't know each other. The one on the left is Fatima, who I was skating with. The one on the right is my friend Oteil. Fatima is French-Moroccan. She'd never been to Egypt. Oteil has Egyptian ancestry, but had never been to Egypt. They were visiting the same places. I don't know how they missed each other, but they were sending pictures like this. And I think that they had very powerful experiences, connecting with the place, connecting with these structures, connecting with art. It made them feel more powerful. But what we do know about vastness or grandeur in design is that it can prime awe, which is a powerful, spiritual, self-transcendent feeling. It's almost ecstatic. It can cause people to cry. We lose sense of the self, usually in a positive way, but it can activate the approach system, but it can also inhibit us. And this is where I really think the work that Mass does, that all of you do, is so important, because what you need to figure out is what's the interaction between this grand, vast architecture and whether it causes awe and approach or awe and inhibition. When I was in grad school, I went to Princeton, and I grew up in the middle of nowhere, never expected to be at a place like Princeton. I remember we arrived in town, I looked at the architecture, and I started crying because I felt overwhelmed by it. I was in awe, and every day I felt like, I better earn this, I better earn this, I better earn this. That's actually not the approach system, that's the inhibition system. So in some ways, that wasn't helping me. For Fatima and Oteil, what was happening was that they were feeling deeply spiritually and socially connected to that place. And so that created this positive version of awe and the approach system. So I think thinking about who's building the place, why does the place exist? Is it there? Is it a friendly or a hostile place? All of those things are going to interact with whether you get awe in a good way or a bad way. So again, I am not an architect, but these are the bullet points from the research that we know of. Raise perceived height, increase visual permeability, favor gentle curves when that's possible, manage density, give users control signals, so ways out, if they don't want to be surrounded by people, and use awe intentionally, thinking about who built it, who is this for, what do they need. How we physically carry ourselves increases or undermines our sense of personal power, which is critical to well-being and societal thriving. The same is true for spaces. And I want us to stop limiting our thinking on well-being and start imagining, how do we empower people? How do we give them agency and voice through our design choices? Thank you.